Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on something with some pretty big potential economic impact. We're talking steel and aluminum tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
President Trump just dropped a 25% tariff on all steel
Yeah.
and aluminum imports.
All of them.
It doesn't matter where they come from. This is across the board. And we've got a great article from CBS News that lays it all out. And I'm really excited to dig into this with you because there are so many different ways this could go.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating development, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It really makes you think about, what are the global implications of this? It's interesting, too. This isn't Trump's first time doing tariffs, right?
Right.
Back in his first term, he did something very similar, but eventually granted a lot of trading partners, duty-free quotas.
Okay.
So the question becomes, is this time going to be different? What's changed? What's the global landscape now?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, in this CBS article, they quote Trump calling this the beginning of making America rich again. I mean, it's
A bold statement.
yeah, a very bold statement. He wants to shake things up, but I just wonder, is this the way to do it?
Well, it's a gamble, that's for sure. And it doesn't even stop there. He's also talked about reciprocal tariffs. So basically, if another country throws a tariff on us, we're throwing one right back at them.
So we're going tariff for tariff. That just seems like a recipe for
Yeah.
a full-blown trade war.
And that's exactly what he said. He was on Air Force One, and he said, if they charge us, we charge them every country. So no one's exempt.
Wow. So he's not messing around.
Nope.
And, speaking of not messing around, the EU is not happy about this at all.
Mm.
The article even talks about how France is already getting ready to basically do the exact same thing back to us.
Yeah, they said they want to replicate the tariffs.
Replicate. Okay. And then Germany's over there saying, look, nobody wins in a tariff conflict. We're all going to lose. What do you make of the EU being so ready to fire back? It feels like things could get out of control pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, they have reason to be concerned, right? The EU is a huge trading partner of ours, and these tariffs could really, really hurt their economies. So I think they're trying to send a strong message that they're not just going to take this lying down. And I think they're also probably worried about what kind of precedent this sets. If we can just slap tariffs on things without any, repercussions, then what's to stop other countries from doing the same thing?
Yeah, yeah. And then you just have this free-for-all.
Right.
Yeah.
And that could really, really undermine the whole global trading system.
And speaking of undermining, and, we talked about unintended consequences earlier, the article brings up something that I think could affect a lot of people listening.
Yeah.
Think about how many things we use every day that are made with steel and aluminum.
There's so many things.
Cars, appliances.
Oh, yeah.
Construction materials.
Yeah.
If all that stuff gets more expensive because of these tariffs, then everything's going to go up in price.
Absolutely. It's a ripple effect. Think about even aluminum in car parts. If that gets more expensive, then car companies are going to have to raise prices.
Yeah.
So your next new car could very well cost you more.
And that's just cars, right?
Right.
This could affect everything, even how much it costs to build a house.
Yeah. Or even a can of soda. Who knows?
Wow. It's crazy to think how much this could actually impact our day-to-day lives.
Well, and remember, it's not like this is happening in isolation. We already have tariffs on stuff coming from Mexico, Canada, and China. So this steel and aluminum thing is part of this bigger picture. This is a pattern with Trump's trade policies.
Oh, totally. And it's interesting, too, with Mexico and Canada, those tariffs were recently put on pause. The article mentions that he's using them as leverage to deal with issues like illegal immigration and fentanyl smuggling. But I wonder, are tariffs really the right way to handle those kinds of things?
Right. That's a huge question. Is this about trade or is this about something else? For Trump, he sees tariffs as a way to reshape trade and achieve multiple goals, not just, about the products themselves. He wants to boost domestic manufacturing. He wants to raise revenue. He even wants to use them to influence foreign policy. But, we are seeing, and we've been talking about it, there's a real risk of things backfiring. We could get retaliatory tariffs and there could be widespread economic harm.
Right. And it's not always clear if the benefits are going to outweigh the risks.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to remember the historical context here. If you look back at times when tariffs were used aggressively, it often led to trade wars. And nobody wins a trade war. It hurts everybody.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What exactly is a trade war? Why is everybody so scared of it?
Well, a trade war is basically when countries start hitting each other back and forth with tariffs. One country raises tariffs, then the other one retaliates with even higher tariffs, and then it can just spiral out of control.
Like a domino effect.
Right. And the problem is, tariffs ultimately raise prices for consumers and businesses. Everything gets more expensive, and that can lead to less demand, slower economic growth, and even job losses. It's really bad for pretty much everybody involved.
So even though these tariffs might sound like they're protecting American jobs, in the end, they could actually end up hurting a lot of people, right? By making everything more expensive.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, and it's hard to predict exactly how it will play out. But history has shown us that tariffs can have these unintended consequences that spread much farther than the original target.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about the potential for a trade war, the impact this could have on consumers and businesses, and how this all fits into Trump's overall approach to trade. But if tariffs are so problematic, why do countries keep using them?
Well, there are a few reasons. Sometimes tariffs are used as a kind of shield, you know,
To protect their own industries.
right, to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. Sometimes they're used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations to try to get other countries to make concessions.
Mhm.
And sometimes they're just a political tool, to appeal to certain groups or to punish rivals.
So it seems like Trump might be using them for all those reasons, right?
It's possible. He wants to protect American industries, he wants to pressure other countries, and he wants to appeal to his base.
But is it worth the risk? I mean, that's the big question.
Exactly. Only time will tell how this all plays out. But one thing's for sure, the stakes are really high, and the entire global economy is watching very closely.
It's like the whole world is holding its breath right now.
To understand this better, it might be helpful to look at a specific historical example. People often talk about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 as a warning about what can happen when you go too far with protectionist trade policies.
Oh yeah, wasn't that during the Great Depression?
Exactly. The Smoot-Hawley Act raised tariffs on something like 20,000 imported goods. The goal was to protect American jobs and businesses, but it completely backfired.
How so?
Well, other countries retaliated with their own
Oh,
tariffs.
okay.
And global trade just plummeted. It ended up making the Great Depression even worse, and it lasted even longer. It was a huge lesson in how tariffs can actually make economic conditions worse instead of better.
Right. And it sounds like a lot of people are worried that Trump's tariffs could end up doing the same thing.
It's a legitimate concern. And while things are different now than they were in the 1930s, the basic principle still applies. Tariffs can really mess up global trade and hurt economic growth.
It makes you think about just how connected everything is. What happens in one part of the world can affect us all.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to think carefully about the potential consequences of actions like these tariffs. It's not just about how it affects specific industries in the short term. We have to think about the long-term impact on the whole global economy.
Okay, so we've talked about the possibility of a trade war, the potential impact on consumers and businesses, the history of tariffs, and how this all fits into the larger picture of Trump's trade policies. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here in part one.
We have, but there's still a lot more to unpack.
For sure.
In part two, we'll dig deeper into the potential economic and geopolitical consequences of these tariffs. We'll also explore some alternative approaches to trade policy, and we'll talk about what this all means for the average listener, so stay tuned.
Yes, definitely stay tuned. Join us for part two as we continue our deep dive into the world of steel tariffs and trade wars.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of steel and aluminum tariffs. Last time we were talking about how these tariffs could maybe spark a trade war and that whole Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act thing, which is kind of scary. It's a complicated situation with so many moving pieces.
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the things I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is, like, we talked about how tariffs can make things more expensive for shoppers, but what if the bigger picture, like the overall economy?
Right, right. That's a huge piece of this puzzle. One of the biggest worries with tariffs is that they can really mess up global supply chains. A lot of companies rely on stuff they import from other countries to make their own products. So if those imports suddenly become more expensive, it makes everything more expensive to produce, right? And then that could lead to higher prices for consumers, or companies might have to cut their profits to stay competitive.
So, okay, so even if a product doesn't directly use any steel or aluminum, it could still be affected by these tariffs if the company uses imported parts in the manufacturing process.
Exactly. It's all connected. And then there's also the whole question of jobs. People often say that tariffs will protect American jobs, but actually they can lead to job losses in other industries. So like if steel gets more expensive because of tariffs, and then American car companies have to pay more for steel, well, they might have to raise their prices, right? And then people might buy fewer cars, and then the car companies might have to lay people off.
Right, so it's not as simple as saying, okay, tariffs equal more American jobs. It's way more complicated than that.
Right.
Some people might benefit, but others might lose out.
Exactly. It's a trade-off, and not always a good one. And don't forget, tariffs are basically just another tax on consumers.
Right, because if the price of imported stuff goes up, we're the ones who end up paying more at the store.
Exactly. And that can hurt household budgets, people have less money to spend, and then the whole economy can slow down.
It sounds like most economists agree that tariffs aren't really a magic solution for fixing trade imbalances or economic problems. Are there other things we could be doing that might actually work better?
Yeah, there are definitely other approaches. One thing we could do is focus on negotiating free trade agreements, agreements that reduce barriers to trade and make things more fair for everyone. We could also invest more in education and training programs to help workers adapt to the changing global economy, help people learn new skills that are in high demand.
So those sound more like long-term solutions rather than these quick fixes like tariffs.
Right. They do take more time and effort, but they also have the potential to create more sustainable economic growth and more people benefit in the long run. Plus, they tend to encourage countries to work together instead of fighting with each other.
Which brings us to another really important part of this whole situation, the geopolitical stuff. We talked about how these tariffs are making things tense with our trading partners, especially the EU. What could happen to international relations if this keeps going, if it's just tariffs and retaliation back and forth?
Yeah, that's a big worry. It could lead to the whole global trading system falling apart. If countries just keep putting up tariffs and trying to protect their own interests, the whole system that's been in place for decades could just crumble. And that would create a lot of uncertainty and instability in the global economy, which would make it really hard for businesses to plan for the future and invest.
So it's not just about the economics, it's about trust and cooperation between countries breaking down.
Exactly. And, we're facing so many global challenges right now, like climate change and pandemics. We need countries to work together to solve those problems. But if everyone's just focused on protecting their own interests and putting up barriers, it's going to be almost impossible to deal with those big challenges effectively.
It makes you realize that all these things are connected. The
hmm
economics, the trade, the international relations, it's all intertwined.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to really think through the potential consequences of things like these tariffs. We need to consider not just the short-term effects on certain industries, but the long-term effects on the whole global economy. And, it's important for everyone to stay informed and engaged with what's happening. I mean, these issues affect all of us, and the more we understand, the better chance we have of making good decisions and influencing policy in a positive direction.
So I'm wondering, what are some things people should be paying attention to as this situation unfolds? Like, what are some signs that things are getting worse or maybe getting better?
Well, one thing to watch for is how other countries react. Are they going to retaliate with their own tariffs, or are they going to try to negotiate a solution? Another thing to pay attention to is what political leaders are saying. Are they digging in their heels and talking about more protectionist policies, or are they hinting at compromise?
So the way they talk about it can tell us a lot about where things are headed.
It can, but it's also really important to be careful about misinformation and propaganda. Make sure you're getting your news from reliable sources, and don't just believe everything you hear, especially if it sounds too simple or too dramatic.
That's good advice for pretty much anything these days, not just trade policy.
Absolutely. And like we were talking about earlier, you should also be thinking about how all this could affect you personally. Stay informed about how tariffs might affect prices for things you buy regularly.
So be aware and be prepared.
Exactly. And don't forget, you have a voice in this process. Talk to your elected officials, let them know what you think about trade policy, get involved in conversations, share your knowledge with other people.
It's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about these huge, complex issues, but it's good to remember that we can actually make a difference.
You absolutely can. Change might happen slowly, but every conversation, every email to a representative, every vote, it all adds up.
It's kind of inspiring when you think about how individual actions can come together and create real change. We've talked a lot about the downsides of tariffs and trade wars, but I'm curious, are there any reasons to be optimistic? What gives you hope for the future of global trade?
I do think there are reasons to be hopeful. For one thing, more and more people are realizing how interconnected the global economy really is. People are starting to understand that what happens on the other side of the world can affect us here at home, and that awareness can be a powerful motivator for countries to work together and find solutions that benefit everyone.
So we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And I also think we have to remember the amazing ingenuity and resilience of humans. We faced huge challenges before, and we've always found ways to overcome them. I really believe we can do the same thing with these challenges facing global trade. We can find a way to create a system that's fairer, more sustainable, and works for everyone.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into these steel tariffs and the whole trade war thing. I feel like we've really gone in depth, talking about how other countries might retaliate and, looking back at history and how these things have played out in the past.
Yeah, we've also looked at how this could affect, the economy and global politics, and we talked about some different ways to approach trade that maybe would work better in the long run.
Right, and some really helpful advice on how we can all stay informed and get involved. But with all this uncertainty hanging over everything, what do you think is going to happen next? What are some of the ways this could all play out?
Well, it's tough to say for sure what the future holds, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know now. One possibility is that these tariffs do kick off a full-blown trade war. Countries start throwing tariffs back and forth, and nobody wants to back down. That could really disrupt the global supply chain, prices go up for everybody, and it could hurt economic growth all over the world.
Okay, so that's kind of a worst case scenario. Is there anything more optimistic that we could be hoping for?
I think so. Another possibility is that everybody takes a deep breath and decides to sit down and negotiate. Maybe countries could compromise, maybe reduce some tariffs or change some domestic policies that other countries see as unfair. But for that to happen, everybody has to be willing to talk and find some common ground.
Right, so we're not doomed to a trade war, but it's going to take some serious diplomacy and a willingness to compromise.
Exactly. And then there's kind of a middle ground. We might see things stay tense for a while, with countries using tariffs as a bargaining chip, trying to get the upper hand in negotiations. The global economy might be a bit shaky for a while, but it wouldn't necessarily be a full-blown trade war.
So basically, there are a lot of ways this could go, and a lot depends on the decisions that leaders make in the next few months or even years.
That's right. And that's why it's so important for everyone to stay informed, talk about these issues, and let their elected officials know what they think. A lot of people feel like, what can I do? This is all so big and complicated.
I know, it's easy to feel like you're just one person, and your voice doesn't really matter.
But it does. I mean, think about it. Change usually happens little by little. Every conversation, every email to your representative, every vote, all of that makes a difference.
So what you're saying is, learn about the issues, talk to people, and vote.
Hmm.
And that can actually help shape things for the better.
Absolutely. And remember, the future of global trade isn't set in stone. We all have a role to play in creating the kind of world we want to live in. So stay curious, stay engaged, and let's all work together.
That's a great message. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. I think we've learned a lot about steel tariffs, trade wars, and the global economy.
I hope so. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. And to everyone listening, thanks for being here with us. We hope you found this informative and maybe even a little empowering. We'll get you next time for another deep dive.